The colors that remain, I still think about him when I see those fishing boats at sunrise. It's been 22 years since Jack and I sat on that weathered dock, our feet dangling above the gentle waves as the sky exploded into colors we couldn't name. We were 24, thinking we had all the time in the world. One day, he said, pointing to a small green boat with chipped paint, "I'll have one of those. Take you out on Sundays. We'll catch dinner and watch the sunset." I believed him. I believed everything Jack said back then. We met at Peterson's Hardware, where I worked the register 3 days a week while taking night classes at the community college. Jack came in for paint. "The color of hope," he'd said with that crooked smile, leaving me wondering if he was teasing or profound. He was a landscaper, hands rough from honest work, fingernails perpetually rimmed with soil no matter how much he scrubbed. The first time I saw him, I hardly noticed him. He was just another customer asking where we kept the fertilizer, his voice quiet beneath the fluorescent lights of Peterson's. But then he came back the next day. And the day after that. Each time with some small excuse. He needed twine, he forgot which brand of weed killer worked best, he was looking for a specific type of trowel. Mr. Peterson started teasing me about my regular, but I just rolled my eyes and pretended not to care. It was raining the day Jack finally asked me out. April showers hammering against the hardware store's metal roof, creating a symphony of pings and echoes that nearly drowned out his question. He'd been examining a display of garden gloves for nearly 20 minutes, picking them up and putting them down again while I pretended to reorganize a nearby shelf of paint samples. "I was wondering," he said, suddenly right beside me, rainwater still dripping from his dark hair onto his shoulders, "if you might want to get coffee sometime? Or dinner? Or just..." He faltered, looking down at the garden gloves in his hands. "I don't know. Something?" I remember smiling at his nervousness, feeling my own heartbeat quicken as I said yes. "Mr. Peterson winked at me from across the store, and I felt my cheeks flush hot with embarrassment, but Jack didn't seem to notice. He was too busy grinning like he'd just won some prize he never expected. Our first date was at Mabel's diner. Nothing fancy, just burgers and 2 sweet tea in chipped white mugs. But sitting across from Jack, watching him talk about his dreams of starting his own landscaping business, I felt something shift inside me. Something I'd never felt with the handful of boys I'd dated in high school. Something real. I fell for him gradually, then all at once, the way he'd bring me wild daisies he found while on jobs, how he'd wait in his truck after my shift even when I ran late, the notebook of poems he kept hidden under his truck seat that he'd occasionally read to me when we were alone. He was terribly embarrassed about those poems. "They're not good," he'd say, his voice gruff with self-consciousness. "Just things I think about sometimes. But they were beautiful to me." Simple, honest words about the way light filtered through leaves or how working the soil made him feel connected to something larger than himself. No one had ever shown me that kind of vulnerability before, that willingness to be seen. By that summer, we were inseparable. My mother worried I was getting too serious too fast with a boy who just mowed lawns for a living. But she didn't see what I saw. His gentleness with the stray cats that roamed the neighborhood, his patience when teaching me to fish even though I squealed every time I had to bait my hook, the way he'd turned down a foreman position at a bigger landscaping company because the owner had mistreated an elderly employee. "You could do better," my mother would say as I got ready for another date with Jack. "I couldn't possibly," I'd reply, knowing she wouldn't understand. We spent that whole summer wrapped in each other's dreams. Long drives with no destination, windows down, radio up. Picnics by the lake where we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Evenings spent on his aunt's porch swing, watching fireflies rise from the grass like tiny stars coming to life. "I'm saving," he told me that spring as we lay on a blanket in the town park. "By next summer, I'll have enough to open my own business. Then I'm going to ask you something important." I knew what he meant. I'd already said yes in my heart. We even started looking at apartments in the classified section of the newspaper, circling possibilities with red pen, calculating budgets on the backs of napkins at Mabel's. Jack wanted a place with a small yard where he could plant a garden. I wanted a kitchen with enough counter space to bake. We both wanted a bedroom with a window facing east, so the morning sun would wake us. "This is the one," he said one afternoon, pointing to an ad for a small cottage on Cedar Street. "Let's drive by it after dinner." The cottage was perfect. White with blue shutters, a maple tree in the front yard, a worn wooden fence surrounding a patch of backyard that would be just enough for Jack's garden dreams. We stood on the sidewalk, staring at it, both of us imagining our future unfolding within those walls. "Next summer," he promised, squeezing my hand. "By next July, we'll be unpacking boxes and arguing about where to put the couch." I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. Earth and pine and possibility. "I can't wait to argue with you about furniture for the rest of our lives." 3 weeks later, my mother called. Aunt Louise in Seattle had suffered a stroke. No one else could go help her through recovery. My mother couldn't leave my father, whose drinking had gotten worse. My sister had 3 small children and couldn't possibly manage. I was the only one without attachments, as my mother put it. "It's just for a few months," she assured me. "Louise has no one else." I still remember the weight of the phone in my hand after she hung up. The way the kitchen suddenly seemed too bright, too harsh. The sound of my own heart pounding in my ears as I realized what this meant. Jack and I stayed up all night, talking, planning, crying a little. He'd wait. We'd write. He'd call when he could afford it. This was just a pause, not an ending. "I'll come visit once I get the business off the ground," he promised. "Maybe I'll like Seattle. Maybe I'll stay." We spent our last days together in a desperate frenzy, trying to cram months of memories into hours. We revisited all our favorite places. The dock where we first kissed, the diner where we'd shared countless meals, the park where we'd picnicked so many summer afternoons. Jack took me to see the cottage on Cedar Street one last time. "It's still going to be us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's just going to take a little longer than we planned." The night before I left, we sat in his truck by the lake until dawn, neither of us willing to lose a single minute to sleep. We watched the sun rise over the water, turning the world gold and pink and new. "That's our color," he said, pointing to a particular shade of orange gold as it reflected across the lake. "That's the color I'm going to paint our front door when you come back to me." I left on a Tuesday. Rain pounded the station as the bus pulled away, Jack standing there, getting smaller, then gone. The first few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms, medication schedules, and Aunt Louise's frequent tears. I called Jack every Sunday from the payphone in the hospital lobby, both of us careful to keep our voices hopeful, both of us pretending this separation wasn't tearing us apart. His letters arrived twice a week, pages filled with updates about his business plans, the people he'd met with, the estimates he'd given. He'd send pressed wildflowers sometimes, or sketches of garden designs he was working on for clients. Once, he sent a small packet of seeds. "For when you come home," his note read. "They're forget-me-nots." Seemed appropriate. I kept every letter in a shoebox under my bed at Aunt Louise's house. At night, when the hospital visits were done and the house was quiet, I'd take them out and reread them, tracing my fingers over his handwriting as if I could feel him through the paper. I wrote back faithfully, telling him about Seattle's endless rain, the surprising beauty of the mountains visible on clear days, the progress of Aunt Louise's recovery. I never told him how lonely I was, how out of place I felt in this city of strangers, how every day felt like walking through fog. I wanted him to believe I was strong. But Aunt Louise's few months stretched into years. Her recovery was slower than expected, and complications kept arising. First pneumonia, then a fall that broke her hip, then depression that made her stop trying to get better at all. By the time she was managing on her own, I'd found a better job than anything available back home. I'd made friends. I'd built a life. And Jack's letters had become shorter, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. It was my fault too. I'd gotten busy, let days pass before answering him. The calls became awkward, filled with pauses neither of us knew how to fill. The distance became more than miles. "Come home," he'd said in what would be our last phone call. "Lou's better now. You've done your part. Come home to me." But I'd just been promoted at the department store where I'd found work. I had my own apartment now, small but mine. I had friends who invited me to dinner parties and hiking trips on weekends. "I can't just leave," I told him. "Not right now. Maybe in a few months." His silence on the other end of the line told me everything. We'd been saying a few months for nearly 2 years. "I understand," he finally said, though his voice said otherwise. That was the beginning of the end, though neither of us was brave enough to say so. We'd become strangers connected only by memories, by promises neither of us knew how to keep anymore. The last letter I received from him was 3 paragraphs long, the handwriting hurried, almost careless. So different from the careful script of his earlier letters. He was doing well, he said. The business was growing. He'd hired 2 employees. He hoped I was happy. He didn't ask when I was coming home. I wrote back, a long letter full of things I couldn't bring myself to say on the phone, that I missed him, that I was scared of how much our lives had diverged, that I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us anymore. I asked if he would consider moving to Seattle, now that his business was established. If perhaps we could start over here. He never replied. I waited weeks, then months. I called his aunt's house, where he'd been living, but she said he'd moved out, gotten his own place. She didn't have the number. I wrote one more letter, sending it to his business address from a phone book, but it came back marked return to sender. Life moved on, as it always does. I dated other men over the years. I even married one. Tom, a kind electrician who never asked why I sometimes stood watching the fishing boats with tears in my eyes. We had a good life for 15 years before he died of a heart attack. No children. Something else I sometimes think about in the quiet hours. Tom was a good husband, steadfast, honest, affectionate in his quiet way. We had a comfortable life, a circle of friends, vacations to national parks every summer. He never seemed to mind that there were parts of my heart I kept locked away, rooms he couldn't enter. Maybe he had his own locked rooms. Maybe that's why we got along so well. After he died, I threw myself into work, into volunteer activities, into anything that would fill the silence of our house. I joined book clubs and gardening societies, took classes in photography and ceramics, went on organized tours to Europe and Asia. I lived what anyone would call a full life. But sometimes, when I least expected it, Jack would appear in my thoughts. When I saw a man kneeling in garden dirt, when I passed a hardware store with paint swatches in the window, when I caught the scent of pine and earth on a hiking trail. Brief, sharp memories that still had the power to take my breath away even decades later. I moved back home last year, after 40 years away. My sister had died, leaving her house empty, and I was tired of Seattle's increasing traffic and noise. I told myself it was practical. Housing prices were lower here, the pace slower. But the truth was, I wanted to see if the memories still lived there, if they were as real as they felt in my mind. The town had changed, of course. The bus station was now a coffee shop. The lake had been developed with expensive homes along much of the shoreline. The hardware store is now a boutique selling overpriced candles. The park has a new playground. Nobody remembers Jack's landscaping business that lasted about 10 years before he sold it and moved away. Nobody but Mrs. Henderson at the post office, who told me he'd married a woman from the next town over. They had 2 daughters. She thought they'd moved to Florida. He asked about you, she said, refilling the stamp dispenser. Whenever he came in. For years. Asked if I'd heard anything. I never had anything to tell him. My heart stuttered at her words. When did he stop asking? She thought for a moment, squinting up at the fluorescent lights. Must have been about 15 years after you left. Right around when he sold the business, I think. His oldest girl was starting high school. 15 years. He'd looked for me for 15 years while I built my life in Seattle, convinced he'd moved on from the moment his letters stopped. I found the cottage on Cedar Street last week. It's still there, though it's yellow now instead of white, with a young family living inside. The maple tree is massive, shading most of the front yard. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at it just as Jack and I had done all those years ago, and for a moment I could almost feel his hand in mine, hear his voice making promises about furniture arrangements and paint colors. The front door is red, not the orange gold of that long-ago sunrise. I've been spending mornings down at the docks, watching the fishing boats go out at dawn, the way Jack and I used to. There's still a green boat, maybe even the same one. The fisherman who owns it is weathered and gray now, with deep creases around his eyes from a lifetime of squinting into the sun. I wonder if he remembers a young couple who used to sit on his dock, making plans that never came true. Yesterday, I was sitting there when an older man sat down beside me. He didn't speak, just nodded politely and gazed out at the water. There was something familiar about the slope of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on his knees. It wasn't Jack. Of course it wasn't. But for a wild moment, my heart forgot the decades. Sometimes I wonder if he still remembers our dock, our sunrise, our plans. If he ever looks at fishing boats and feels the ache of what could have been. If the colors of sunrise still make him think of me the way they make me think of him. I've thought about trying to find him. It wouldn't be hard in this age of internet searches and social media. His daughters might have Facebook pages. His landscaping business might still exist somewhere in Florida, even if he's retired. I could probably track him down with a few hours of effort. But what would I say? I'm sorry I stayed away too long? I'm sorry I let you go? I've thought of you every time I've seen the sun rise for 40 years? What right do I have to disrupt the life he built without me, to insert myself into his memories again after all this time? So instead, I come to the dock. I watch the sun rise. I let myself remember. I don't regret the life I've had. I've loved and been loved. I've seen beautiful places and met wonderful people. But there are moments. Like now, as I watch that same green boat, or one just like it, glide across the water. When I wonder about the life I didn't have. The one that slipped through my fingers because I got on that bus and neither of us was strong enough to hold on through the distance. I wonder about the children we might have had, the garden Jack would have planted in the backyard of the cottage on Cedar Street, the Sunday mornings we would have spent out on a little green fishing boat. I wonder about the arguments we would have had over bills and in-laws and whose turn it was to take out the trash. I wonder about the way we would have grown old together, his hand in mine, watching countless sunrises from countless docks. Last night, I dreamed of him. We were young again, sitting on the dock, our whole lives ahead of us. In the dream, he turned to me and said, "It's not too late. It's never too late." I woke with tears on my face and his name on my lips. But it is too late. That's the cruelest truth about life. You never know which choices will define everything that follows, which moments are the hinges upon which your entire future swings. You make a decision that seems temporary, seems reversible, only to look back decades later and realize that was the moment everything changed. The light breaks across the water now, scattering gold and pink across the surface. I catch my breath as I see it. There it is, that exact shade of orange gold, the color of the front door Jack promised to paint for me. The color we claimed as ours. The colors that remain when everything else is gone. Paper promises. The box of letters sits on my kitchen table, faded and water-stained at the corners. I found it yesterday while cleaning out Mom's attic, tucked behind Christmas decorations and old tax returns. My name is written on top in his handwriting. A little slanted, always pressing too hard with the pen. Daniel. It's been 30 years since I've seen him, but my heart still recognizes his name like a language it never forgot how to speak. I pour another cup of coffee and open the box. Inside are dozens of letters. All addressed to me, all unopened. Letters my mother never gave me. Letters that might have changed everything. My hands tremble as I pick up the first envelope. The postmark is faded, but I can make out the date, October 1991. 30 years of silence, contained in these fragile paper rectangles. 30 years of questions I'd long ago stopped asking. We met at the diner where I waited tables after high school. I was saving for community college, one coffee refill tip at a time. Daniel was passing through, working construction for the summer before heading back to his job at a car factory 3 states away. He had kind eyes and ordered the same thing every day, turkey sandwich, no mayo, extra pickles. I can still picture him sitting at the counter. Always the same stool if it was available, the third one from the end. He wore faded jeans and work boots, his dark hair cut short but always a little messy on top. His hands were calloused, with permanent grease stains embedded in the creases of his knuckles. The first time he came in, I barely noticed him. The diner was always busy during lunch, and one more construction worker in a sea of coveralls and dusty boots didn't stand out. But he kept coming back, day after day, always sitting in my section even when other parts of the diner had empty seats. He was quiet at first, just ordering his sandwich and thanking me when I refilled his iced tea. But gradually, he started making small talk. Commenting on the weather, asking how my day was going, leaving generous tips that I knew he couldn't really afford on a construction worker's wages. You ever notice, he said to me one day as I was wiping down the counter near his stool, how people don't really look at each other anymore? Everyone's always in such a hurry. I remember stopping, cloth in hand, surprised by the observation. I guess I hadn't thought about it. You do, though, he said, those kind eyes meeting mine. You always look at people when they're talking to you. It's nice. I felt myself blush, suddenly aware of how long we'd been maintaining eye contact. It's just good customer service, I mumbled, moving down the counter to wipe a non-existent spill. But he was right. I did try to really see people, to acknowledge their humanity in a world that often treated service workers as invisible and customers as walking wallets. And I was startled that he had noticed this about me, had been paying enough attention to see beyond my uniform and name tag. The next day, he left a small origami crane next to his plate when he finished his lunch. No note, no explanation. Just this delicate paper bird made from a napkin. I kept it, tucking it into my apron pocket where it crinkled softly throughout my shift, a small secret that made me smile. He asked me out a week later, waiting until the lunch rush was over and I was refilling salt shakers at the end of the counter. I'm only in town for the summer, he said, his eyes on the counter. But I was wondering if maybe you'd like to see a movie with me sometime. Or just take a walk. Something. There was a vulnerability in his voice that touched me, this strong man with his work-roughened hands, nervous about asking me on a date. I said yes before I could overthink it, before I could remind myself that summer romances never lasted, that he would be gone by September. Our first date was at the old movie theater downtown. The one that only charged $3 because they showed films that had already left the bigger cinemas. I don't even remember what movie played. I just remember being hyper-aware of his arm next to mine on the armrest, the clean soap smell of him, the way he asked if I wanted popcorn or candy with such earnestness, as if my snack preference was the most important decision in the world. Afterward, we walked by the river that ran through town, talking until midnight. He told me about growing up in a small town in Indiana, about dropping out of high school when his father died to help support his mother and younger sisters, about finding work at the auto factory and slowly building a stable life. The trick is, he told me on our third date, sharing a milkshake at the drive-in theater, to find something solid and stick with it. Nothing flashy about making car parts, but it pays the bills. I loved his practical nature, how his dreams were modest but real. A small house, a reliable job, someone to come home to. I'd grown up with a father whose grand schemes had left us scraping by, mother always anxious about which bill couldn't be paid that month. Daniel's steadiness felt like solid ground beneath my feet. Our summer unfolded in a series of simple pleasures, picnics by the river, drives in his old Ford pickup with the windows down, evenings spent on the porch swing at my parents' house, talking until my mother flashed the porch light to signal it was time for him to go home. We went to the county fair and rode the Ferris wheel, ate cotton candy that turned our tongues blue, held hands as we walked past the livestock exhibitions and craft displays. One evening, as we sat on a blanket watching a local band play in the park, Daniel turned to me with an unusually serious expression. "I know I'm leaving in a few weeks," he said, his voice low enough that I had to lean close to hear him over the music. "But I want you to know. This isn't just a summer thing for me. You're not just a girl in a town I'm passing through." My heart had swelled at his words, even as anxiety flickered at the edges of my happiness. I'd promised myself I wouldn't fall for him, wouldn't let myself imagine a future beyond August. But somewhere along the way, when I wasn't paying attention, I'd broken that promise to myself. "What are you saying?" I asked, needing to hear him be explicit. "I'm saying I love you," he answered simply. "And I want to figure out a way to make this work even after I go back." No grand declarations, no flowery speeches. Just those plain, honest words. That was Daniel all over, straightforward, sincere, no games. I loved him for it. By August, we were in love, the kind that feels both wild and certain. But summer was ending. His job was waiting. I still needed another year of saving before I could afford school. "I'm coming back for you," he said the night before he left, both of us sitting in his car outside my mother's house. 1 year. I'll save every penny. Then I'll move here, or you'll move there, whatever we decide. But I'm not letting you go. We spent his last night together parked at the overlook above town, the lights below us twinkling like earthbound stars. We talked for hours about our future. Where we would live, the jobs we might have, even the number of children we might want someday. In the safety of darkness, surrounded by the summer sounds of crickets and distant trains, we built a life together out of words and wishes. I believed him. We made plans. We'd write every week. Call when we could afford it. Visit at Christmas if possible. The morning he left, he gave me a small box. Inside was a silver chain with a tiny compass pendant. "So you can always find your way back to me," he said, fastening it around my neck. The metal was cool against my skin, but quickly warmed. I watched his truck disappear down the street, the red taillights growing smaller until they vanished around a corner. I touched the compass at my throat and made a silent promise that this wouldn't be the end of our story. The first few months were torture but sweet. His letters arriving like clockwork every Tuesday, full of everyday details about his life, his work, his plans for us. I wrote back, sharing my small-town news, my progress toward college, how many days until we'd see each other again. His letters were nothing like the romantic poetry you see in movies. They were simple, sometimes almost awkwardly so. He wrote about the weather, about a stray dog he'd started feeding behind his apartment building, about how the factory had increased their quota and everyone was working overtime. But between the lines of those ordinary details was a constancy that moved me. His steady presence reaching across the miles, his life opening to include me even from a distance. "Saved another $200 this month," he wrote in one letter. "At this rate, we'll have enough for a deposit on an apartment by next summer." Nothing fancy, but it'll be ours. I kept his letters in a shoebox under my bed, reading and rereading them on nights when the distance felt too great, when I missed the solid warmth of him beside me. I slept with his flannel shirt. The one he'd accidentally left behind, until it lost his scent. I worked double shifts at the diner, putting away every extra dollar for the community college fund that would eventually become our future together. We talked on the phone every Sunday night, brief calls because long distance was expensive, neither of us wanting to waste precious minutes with complaints or doubts. We focused instead on our plans, on the countdown to Christmas when he would visit for 3 days, on the summer reunion that would be more permanent. Then his letters stopped. October, November, nothing. I called his apartment, no answer. I wrote more letters. No response. By Christmas, I was frantic, then angry, then heartbroken. He'd promised. He'd made me believe. I remember sitting by the phone on Christmas Eve, willing it to ring, making excuses for him in my mind. Maybe he'd been in an accident. Maybe he'd lost my number. Maybe he'd had to go home to Indiana for a family emergency. Any explanation seemed better than the most obvious one. That he'd moved on, found someone else, decided that what we had wasn't worth the trouble of maintaining. My mother found me crying in my room that night. "Oh, honey," she said, sitting beside me on the bed. I was afraid this would happen. Men like that, they make promises they never intend to keep. Not Daniel, I insisted through my tears. He wouldn't just disappear. Something must have happened to him. She patted my hand, her face soft with a pity that only made me cry harder. Whatever the reason, he's gone. And you're young, you'll find someone else, someone who's actually here. I eventually moved on, finished my accounting certificate, got a job at the bank, dated a few men without ever feeling that certainty I'd felt with Daniel. None of them made me feel like solid ground. None of them looked at me the way he had, as if I was something precious he'd been lucky enough to find. I married Richard when I was 27. He was a good man. Stable, kind, with a steady job as a manager at the supermarket. We had a comfortable life, raised 2 sons who are now grown with families of their own. Richard was always supportive, never jealous. We had 35 solid years before cancer took him 5 years ago. Our marriage was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. We ran our household together, made decisions together, faced life's challenges as a team. Richard was a wonderful father to our boys, teaching them to fish and change oil and treat people with dignity. I grew to love him deeply, in the quiet way that blooms from years of consistent care and companionship. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I would wonder about Daniel. Why he disappeared. Whether any of it had been real. On rare occasions, I would take out the silver compass pendant, tucked away in my jewelry box all these years, and run my thumb over its surface, remembering the boy who gave it to me and the promises we'd made. Now I know. With trembling fingers, I opened the first letter, postmarked October 15, 1991. My dearest Elaine, I'm writing this from the hospital. There was an accident at the plant 3 days ago. The words blur as tears fill my eyes. I blink them away, determined to read every word I should have read 30 years ago. Daniel had been working overtime, helping to fix a malfunctioning press. Something went wrong. The safety guard failed, the machine engaged unexpectedly. His right hand was caught, crushed between metal components before anyone could hit the emergency stop. The doctors say I'm lucky, he wrote. I could have lost the whole arm. But they couldn't save 3 of my fingers. The index and middle finger are gone above the second knuckle, and my ring finger is completely gone. They say with physical therapy I'll still have some function, but it'll never be the same. I press my own hand to my mouth, imagining his pain, the fear he must have felt, the uncertainty about his future. And all this time, I'd thought he'd simply forgotten me, moved on to someone new. Letter after letter tells the story. The surgery. The infection that nearly killed him. The depression that followed when he couldn't work. His fear of being a burden. His decision to release me from promises made during happier times. I can't ask you to tie yourself to half a man with no prospects, one letter reads. You deserve the whole world, and I can't even open a jar of pickles anymore. I want to reach through time and shake him, tell him that his missing fingers wouldn't have mattered to me, that I would have helped him through the physical therapy, the job search, the rebuilding of his life. That I loved him, not the configuration of his hand. The letters grow darker as weeks pass. His savings depleted by medical bills, his apartment lost when he couldn't pay rent, his move back to his mother's house in Indiana. The shame in his words is palpable as he describes applying for disability benefits, the pitying looks from former colleagues, his struggles with the simplest daily tasks. I keep trying to write to you, he admits in a letter dated December. But I tear up the letters before I send them. What can I offer you now? I promised you stability, a future. Now I can't even promise I'll be able to support myself, let alone us. It's better this way. Better you think I'm just another guy who made promises he didn't keep than know the truth. Yet he kept writing, kept sending letters I never received. Kept reaching for me across a divide he thought couldn't be bridged. And the final letter, dated February 1992, I called your house today and spoke to your mother. She told me you've moved on, that you're dating someone from your college. She said it would be kinder not to confuse you with my letters. I suppose she's right. I love you enough to let you go. Be happy, Elaine. That's all I've ever wanted. My hands are shaking so badly I can barely hold the paper. My mother. My own mother had intercepted his calls, his letters. Had lied to him about me dating someone else. Had decided, without consulting me, what was best for my future. I remember that spring after Daniel disappeared. My mother's sudden enthusiasm for introducing me to nice young men from our church, her insistence that I focus on my classes rather than moping around over Daniel. Her relief when I finally started dating again nearly 2 years later. Had she known all along where he was, what had happened to him? Had she been waiting for me to move on so her deception would be justified? A memory surfaces. My mother collecting the mail before I got home from classes, her vague answers when I asked if anything had come for me. At the time, I'd been too wrapped in my own heartbreak to question it. Now, 30 years too late, the pattern seems obvious. I sit at my kitchen table, surrounded by 30 years of might-have-beens, and cry for the first time since Richard's funeral. For Daniel's pain. For my mother's well-intentioned meddling. For the life we never had the chance to build. When the tears finally stop, I make a decision. The return address on the final letter is from 1992, but it's a start. People leave trails. In this digital age, finding someone isn't impossible if you're determined enough. And I am determined. Not because I expect some fairy tale reunion, we're both in our 60s now, shaped by different lives, different joys and sorrows. But because he deserves to know his letters finally reached me. That they mattered. That he mattered. I spend the afternoon reading every letter, absorbing the life he lived without me. After the accident, he'd eventually found work as a dispatcher for a trucking company. A job he could do with his injured hand. He'd gone back to school on vocational rehabilitation, earned his GED, taken some accounting classes. He'd made a life for himself, piece by piece, in the wake of loss. The last few letters mention a correspondence course in creative writing he'd enrolled in, how writing had become a solace during his recovery. I'm not very good, he admitted in one letter, but it gives me something to focus on besides what I've lost. Sometimes I write about us, about that summer, about the life we planned. I hope you don't mind being a character in my stories. I wonder if he ever published anything, if there are words of his out in the world that I could find and read. Another connection to the man I lost. As evening falls, I make myself a simple dinner and continue reading by lamplight, unable to put the letters down now that I've started. The final letter in the box is dated April 1992, a full 8 months after he'd disappeared from my life. It's shorter than the others, just a single page. Dear Elaine, this will be my last letter. Your mother is right. You deserve a clean break, a chance to move forward without ghosts from the past pulling you back. I just wanted to say thank you. For the summer. For showing me what it feels like to be truly seen by another person. For making me believe, if only for a little while, that I was worthy of a beautiful life. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're happy. I hope your life is filled with all the good things you deserve. With love, always, Daniel. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the phantom echo of heartbeats separated by decades. He'd thought I was dating someone else, moving on with my life, while I spent nights crying myself to sleep, wondering why he'd abandoned me. The cruelty of it takes my breath away. In the morning, I start my search. My son Michael has always teased me about being technologically challenged, but I'm motivated now in a way I've never been before. I open my laptop and type Daniel Whitaker, Indiana, into the search bar. Thousands of results appear. Too many to be useful. I need to narrow it down. I remember he mentioned his hometown in one of the letters, Morris Creek, Indiana. I add that to my search terms. This time, the results are more promising. A local newspaper article from 2010 mentions a Daniel Whitaker who taught creative writing at the community college. Another hit shows him listed as a contributor to a regional literary magazine. A Facebook page for the Morris Creek Public Library includes a photo of an older man with silver hair leading what appears to be a writing workshop. I enlarge the photo, my heart racing. The quality isn't great, but those kind eyes are unmistakable. It's him. Older, of course, his dark hair now completely silver, new lines etched around his eyes and mouth. But unmistakably Daniel. The caption reads, Local author Daniel Whitaker leads our monthly writers group. Join us the first Tuesday of every month. Local author. He did publish his writing after all. I search his name along with author and find several entries. 3 novels published by a small regional press, a collection of short stories, occasional pieces in literary journals. Most of the work is described as quiet stories of ordinary lives and second chances. I wonder if I'm in those pages somewhere. If the girl from the diner lives on in his words. I find the library's phone number and, before I can lose my nerve, I dial. Morris Creek Public Library, a cheerful voice answers. How may I help you? I'm calling about your writers group, I say, my voice steadier than I feel. The one led by Daniel Whitaker? Oh yes. Are you interested in joining? It's the first Tuesday of each month. Anyone is welcome. Actually, I'm trying to get in touch with Mr. Whitaker. Is there a way I could leave a message for him? There's a slight pause. We don't give out personal information about our volunteers, but I could pass along your name and number next time he's in. I leave my details, wondering if he'll recognize my name after all these years, if he'll want to hear from me at all. Maybe he's married. Maybe he's built a life so complete that reopening old wounds would only cause pain. Maybe I should leave the past in the past. But I think of his letters, the pain and longing in those pages, and I can't walk away again. Not without at least giving him the chance to know what really happened. 3 days later, my phone rings with an unfamiliar Indiana area code. My hands shake as I answer. Hello? There's a pause, a soft intake of breath. Then, Elaine? Is it really you? His voice is lower than I remember, roughened by age, but still unmistakably his. The voice that once told me he loved me, that promised to come back for me. Daniel, I say, and just his name in my mouth feels like coming home. Yes, it's me. I don't understand, he says. After all this time, why now? I tell him everything. Finding the box of letters, learning the truth about my mother's deception, my need to let him know I never received them. As I speak, I can hear his breathing on the other end of the line, occasional soft sounds that might be surprise or pain. "I thought you'd moved on," he says when I finish. "Your mother said you were dating someone from school, that you were happy. That the kindest thing I could do was let you go." I was heartbroken, I tell him. "I thought you'd disappeared, that everything you'd said to me was a lie." "Never," he says with sudden fierceness. "I never lied to you, Elaine. Not about anything." We fall silent, 30 years of separate lives stretching between us like a vast, unbridgeable distance. "Are you married?" he finally asks. "Do you have a family?" "I was married," I say. "For 35 years. Richard died 5 years ago. We have 2 sons, both grown with families of their own." I pause. "And you?" Another pause. "No. I never married." There were relationships over the years, but nothing that lasted. Nothing that felt. He doesn't finish the sentence, but he doesn't need to. I understand perfectly. We talk for nearly 2 hours, filling in the outlines of lives lived apart. He tells me about his journey from factory worker to author, how losing his fingers led him to discover his voice as a writer. I tell him about my years at the bank, my sons, the quiet contentment of my marriage to Richard. "I've read your letters," I tell him. "All of them. I wish I'd received them then. I wish I'd known." "Would it have made a difference?" he asks, his voice careful, controlled. "If you'd known what happened, would you have waited?" "Yes," I say without hesitation. "I would have come to you. I would have helped you through it." A soft sound comes through the phone. Perhaps a sigh, perhaps something more vulnerable. "I have your books," I tell him, changing the subject. I'd ordered them online while waiting for his call, paying extra for overnight shipping. "I've been reading them. I think I recognize pieces of us in them." He laughs softly. "You always were in my writing. Even when I tried to create completely fictional characters, pieces of you would appear." A gesture, a phrase, the way you'd look at me as if you could see all the way through to the back of my skull. I smile, though he can't see it. "I'd like to see you," I say, the words coming out before I can reconsider them. "If you're open to that." The silence that follows seems endless. "I'm not the same person you knew," he finally says. "Not just the hand. Everything about me is different now." "I'm not the same either," I reply. "But I'd like to meet the person you've become." We make arrangements. In 2 weeks, I'll fly to Indianapolis, rent a car, drive to Morris Creek. We'll meet at a cafe near the library. No expectations, just 2 old friends reconnecting after a long separation. We're both too practical, too scarred by life, to expect more than that. But as I hang up the phone, I find myself touching the silver compass pendant I dug out of my jewelry box after finding the letters. The needle still points north, still promises a way forward even after all these years. Tomorrow, I'll begin preparations for the trip. Today, I'll read every word he wrote, honor every promise he tried to keep. Some things are worth being late for, even if they arrive 30 years after they were meant to. And perhaps, though I hardly dare to hope, some loves are patient enough to wait.